Thank you very much, EEO, for giving me an opportunity to speak tonight. I would also like to acknowledge Clara, who's helping me in the business. The EEO should be proud of that because Clara was actually volunteering with the EEO in the past. Yeah, I was asked to bring also some element of international perspective to the discussions tonight, because I think it's really important that we take learnings from other countries. I've done renewables in about 20 countries around the world, mostly at the utility scale end and at the commercial scale end, sort of medium market, less so at the residential market. But I think there are enormous learnings that we can draw from overseas experience. If I could maybe just briefly go through some of the market segments that Paul has already spoken about and give you an indication where I think some of the limiting factors for further deployment are. Residential, as much as it is very popular, and as much as Paul has said we shouldn't focus on that, I would actually agree. The main reason is it's expensive. It's the most expensive form of deploying solar that is around, and that is what Australia has focused on. There's a very high transaction cost, because whether you sell a 1.5 kilowatt system or a 15 kilowatt system, the work that is involved in terms of making contact with the customer and engaging and providing a quote is probably quite similar. So I believe residential has a strong limitation in terms of the cost structure of deployment. It also is not optimal for the electricity systems, and as Paul has pointed out, it produces power when you don't need it, and it doesn't produce the power when you need it most, or in the location where you need it most. And it's probably also not optimal from a societal outcome perspective, and a lot of discussion has been going on against renewables from certain sectors of the industry, which argued it's a so-called regressive form of taxation, which means people that earn more and are normally on higher taxes and can afford more contribution to society can actually benefit from subsidies that are then cross-subsidized from the poorer sections of society. While it's a fairly heavy charge and you could make arguments against it, I think it's still something to be kept in mind. Residential renewables subsidize individuals, and quite often the people that can afford it better than others. And some work like the work that Luke Reed here from Energetic Communities is doing obviously tries to address this issue by looking at making renewables available to all. If you go into the commercial scale sector, I again would agree with Paul, that is what the industry should really be focusing on, because that is where I have always seen internationally the strongest market develop and the most sustained market develop. If you look at the limiting factors, and obviously we're talking about what inputs we can provide to the Queensland Law Reform agenda in this field for the current submissions. One of the key issues that I'm working on every day is the separation between investment and use. If you ask a business to invest into renewables, quite often they will turn around and say, well, yeah, it's great, it's a good idea, corporate social responsibility, all of that, it ticks all those boxes, but I've got a different investment priority. So a lot of businesses do not actually want to put their money into solar because it's not their core business activity. And so a lot of my work, and I have to declare that interest because some of my following slides will be tainted by that, is around projects that use power purchase agreements, leases, or loan structures in order to separate the financing of these projects from the actual use of those projects. A second point, again, I wonder why I'm even giving this presentation. Paul has touched on site access. So especially in a commercial context, quite often the user of the solar does not have ownership of the building and therefore cannot sort of deploy it in quite the same way as a building owner could. Now, there are actually legal structures that would allow that. For example, if you took a lease over the roof space, but taking leases over roof spaces is actually a very costly exercise that you have to go through, and I will come back to that in a moment. Next is the connection process that can sometimes be fraught. It's not too difficult for commercial scale, it's much harder for utility scale, but still it's a fraught process. It's very much the dependency on the current tariff structure that allows the sales process to proceed. So Paul has talked about the difference between energy charges and demand charges. We've seen a drift towards more demand charges and less energy charges. And we can't really offset all the demand, but we can only offset energy. Now, this is all good, and if if we have managed to install a system on a certain assumption of a tariff structure, what happens if in 3 years when the next regulatory cycle occurs, those tariff structures are actually changed? And maybe this is an area where law reform could actually help. And lastly, and this is again something that is particularly relevant in power purchase agreement environments for renewables, are the licensing requirements under the National Energy Customer Framework that has come into effect last year in Queensland. You will see I highlighted 3 items in red. The reason I've done this is because I believe if you want to make a submission to the Queensland government, these are the areas to focus on. Renewables have a lot of problems that they need to overcome, but this is a law reform process for Queensland, and we need to focus on those areas that are actually driven by Queensland legislation, because this is the agenda that we can promote at this very moment. There will be issues to be resolved at local level, as we have heard earlier, and some that will need to be resolved at the Commonwealth level, but certain issues can be dealt with at the state level. Utility scale is not really the focus for my presentation. Just very briefly, the 2 main challenges are the pricing against fossil fuels. Utility scale projects don't feed in behind the meter where the consumer is located, so it needs to be transported over the grid. And once it's transported over the grid, it incurs all the distribution and transmission charges, duals and tours charges, unless there are some circumstances where you can claim avoided distribution and avoided transmission charges. And the connection process for utility scale renewables is absolutely flawed. There are a limited number of connection points, and there's enormous cost and timing implication. Any good installer, any larger contractor can install multiple megawatts literally within a few weeks. The installation process in itself is very, very straightforward and very short. But if you have a lead time of 2 years to build a substation, to deploy a large amount of solar, that really impacts on the entire project structure. If you look overseas and what the success factors were for larger renewable energy industries, it was around, well, I tried to group some of the key issues for that. One is the ease and timing of grid connection and the ability to export back into the grid and not be stuck just behind the meter. The second one is a revenue certainty. So if you deploy renewables, what return can you actually expect to repay the upfront investment? Quite often in the past these were feed-in tariffs, but it's no longer the case internationally that that's the main driver. Site access, very critical issue, and one where law reform could actually help with working around priorities. Low regulatory hurdles, and this might be a bit controversial, the absence of subsidies. Wherever we had subsidies in place, subsidy hunters were out chasing the quick buck while the subsidy is in place. As soon as the subsidy comes to an end, those industries would collapse, and I think Paul has probably been through a number of those boom and bust cycles that subsidies have created. I actually would argue that we should get rid of subsidies, but lower the thresholds on all other criteria. It would create a really large and sustainable industry. Now, law is quite esoteric for a lot of people, so I tried to create a few very clear examples where I can show you where a tiny bit of law reform could actually make a very significant difference. The first one is the National Energy Retail Law, which came into effect last year here in Queensland. This is a law that every retailer needs to adhere to. And a retailer is obviously the organizations like Origin and AGL and Dodo and Sanctuary Energy and whoever is out there as a retailer, but in fact it's also everyone else that, and if you just read this, a person must not, in this jurisdiction, read Queensland, engage in the activity of selling energy to a person for premises unless either they hold a retail authorization or are exempt. So if you put in place a power purchase agreement, currently helping Community Solar Sunshine Coast develop a small 100 kilowatt system on the rooftop of Button Private Hospital, they will be selling energy to a person, namely Uniting Care, for premises, namely that Button Private Hospital. So they will need to get either retail authorization, which is not the way to go, or need to be an exempt seller. Now, in order to become an exempt seller, you have to go through an application for licensing exemptions, which is a fairly significant bureaucratic effort. There are lots of people out there that got these exemptions, so it's not necessarily hard to get, but it is still a bureaucratic hurdle that is not necessary if you have a one-on-one relationship that is meant to last for 10 years. It's just not this type of scenario where you need to implement consumer protection. Now, I put this into the category of law reform. Why? It actually says national energy retail law. Well, actually, it's a national scheme, but it is legislation that's adopted in each individual state. So there is actually scope for the Queensland government to implement legislation that derogates and qualifies its participation in the NECF framework. Now, it would, of course, rattle quite a few feathers to do that, but it is possible to step away from some of the obligations of that framework. The next example, this is actually quite an exciting one, and again, it would rattle lots of feathers because it really touches on one of the fundamental ways the property industry works. Imagine you have a commercial building. A commercial developer has developed a building that will be used by a small business. They have developed the building, they build it, they put financing on it in order to get it up, and have a mortgage on the building. Then you've got a small business with a lease coming in, and they are our ideal customer for a power purchase agreement. What happens next is that they can't afford to build the installation, so they need to get a third party in. The third party says, great, let me take a lease of the roof, I put my solar on. With that solar, I will supply the small business for 10 years with electricity, and everyone is happy. Maybe the system goes to the building owner in the end, but for those first 10 years, I need to retain the asset of the solar installation on the rooftop, because I've actually financed my solar installation myself. So, taking a lease over the rooftop is not necessarily cheap, but possible. You need to subdivide, so that you can actually take a lease just over the roof space. So there's some cost involved in that, in drawing up a survey plan, and the requirements in Queensland are actually quite high for that. And you need to take out that lease. Now the problem is that lease comes at a point in time when somebody has already put a mortgage on the building. A mortgage that financed the building being set up. Now, strictly speaking, if you try to put a lease on a building where there's a mortgage, unless you get consent from the mortgagee, you have second priority. If the building owner goes insolvent, property bubbles, you might actually lose the right to have your lease over the roof. Now, roof spaces are usually fairly useless spaces. Would it be possible to rethink the way we prioritize roof space by giving priority to leases that secure renewable energy installations over the rights of the mortgagees? So if a mortgagee could still sell the building under its power of sale, but it would have to sell it subject to a lease that allows the solar installation to continue to be in place. It would be a tiny, tiny amendment to legislation, a very fundamental one, because this is not the way the property law works, but it would be a tiny amendment that would allow financing security on renewable energy installations. And it is, of course, state legislation. Now, just very briefly on, again, utility scale, the success factors that I've encountered internationally are somewhat different from commercial scale. So securing sites usually not an issue. There's an outright purchase, or there's long-term lease over what was previously agricultural land or other forms of lower grade land. So the main ones are grid connection, ease, and timing. Let me just briefly speak about cost in a moment. The revenue certainty and the power purchase agreements and the duration for which you can get that, and maybe also importantly the valuation of ancillary services. Renewable is not as dumb as just selling electrons, kilowatt hours. There are actually a lot of ancillary services that renewable energy installations can provide. But let me just talk very briefly about the cost of grid connection. It is critical that in the Australian market, the way grid cost is distributed is on a first-come, best-dressed basis. So the fossil fuel generators had the privilege of tapping into a grid at a time that it was all state-owned, they actually never had to pay for that. They didn't have to pay for grid access because the grid was actually built for them, and it was built even around them, namely radial systems away from main power stations. If you now build a wind farm in a remote location or a very large solar power station, you actually, as the last coming person, have to pay for the grid connection cost or for any upgrade in grid cost. Sorry, upgrade cost for the grid further down the line. Any constraints there are, you actually have to cover. That's a very, very extreme position that the Australian regulatory system has taken. And it is quite different to what you encounter in other countries, where quite often there's actually an obligation on the utility service provider to make the grid available within a reasonable vicinity. So that might be just a kilometer or 2 kilometers away, rather than potentially 100 kilometers away. But it is an enormous cost burden, especially on the larger installations, to provide for grid access. One area which I've put in just very briefly is the complexity of some of the things that we have to deal with. Power purchase agreements, a lot of people think it's just about buying and selling kilowatt hours of electricity. It's actually much more than that. Developing a power purchase agreement takes a lot of time and a lot of thought, because it is all about risk allocation. What risks do you want to leave with the renewable generator, and what risks do you want to pass on to the customer? And I've just sort of tried to snapshot a few of the key risks that you have to deal with. And as you can already see, the risk of the solar resource not being available. You were talking about the one day that the sun doesn't shine and therefore there is no power generated. In a power purchase environment, this could be fundamentally allocated to either party. If you have an energy charging model, it would be allocated effectively to the generator. If you've got a capacity charging model, it would be with the off-taker. So power purchase agreements are very complex beasts, and I think part of a renewable energy policy would need to include an enormous amount of education so that these instruments that are available are actually better understood and more readily available.
How do you explain off-taker and generator?
Sure. The generator is the person generating the power, and the off-taker is the person taking the electricity and using it. So it's the electricity user. Now, let me maybe just finally talk here, because I think my time's up. Closer? Okay. Let me just talk you briefly through a scheme that I was asked to advise on about a year ago, and where it went pear-shaped. Again, an area for potential law reform. This was with a very small start-up property developer that actually has a great preparedness to include renewable energy. Their main issue is they didn't want to make the units more expensive by including rooftop solar and selling it that way. They actually wanted to make sure that there's no additional upfront cost to the investors into the units. So the traditional setup for power supply to a new development that works through a body corporate is that body corporate finds an electricity retailer for, say, corridors, the garage, and so on, so for the common areas. Then each unit has its own electricity supply agreement with a retailer. So this is the sort of agreement that you have with Origin or AGL or others. So everyone procures their own electricity. Now, it's actually quite a mad setup if you think about it. This was a pricing sheet at the time, and as you can see, this is the consumption charge, so the per kilowatt hour. This is what you consume and what, in a residential context, you can offset by your solar. It's about 24 cents per kilowatt hour. But increasingly, you've got service fees, day charges, capacity charges, and similar structures where you pay per day, irrespective of how much you use. In this case, Origin Energy, $1.28 per day for the pleasure of Origin's company at your doorstep. Now, imagine if you have only, say, 3 units in a very, very small development and a body corporate, so 4 people connecting. This is about roughly, say, $500 a year. So if you've got 4 people incurring that charge, that's about $2,000 a year just to have 4 separate connections into the grid. if you were to turn this all into a new structure where there's only one single supply between the network and the property development, you'll probably be a business customer, I assume. The day charge is actually significantly, only marginally higher on an individual basis, but significantly lower on an aggregate basis. Rather than having 4 times $1.23, you've got once $1.54, and a similar rate for energy charges. So just by aggregating the 4 connections into the grid into one single connection, you can save about $1,500 a year. And that kind of goes a long way towards paying for a renewable energy installation. So what we were hoping to do, and this is sort of how we got approached, is to say, we've got a body corporate that has that one single connection to a retailer, to Origin or whoever. What this body corporate then does, obviously the units need electricity, this is called an on-selling arrangement, where a building owner buys the power in bulk and passes it on. Perfectly legal, there's a framework, there's a lot of limitations around that framework. It's not easy to implement, but it is perfectly possible to implement that. So rather than these units buying from a retailer, they now buy from the body corporate. If you have such a setup, what you could actually do, you can have a third party, because that was part of our brief. The body corporate doesn't want to have additional costs up front. You've got green investors putting money into a solar and a combined heat and power, because we were looking at providing electricity, but also hot water and air conditioning all at the same time. So put physical assets into the property, somewhere in the basement or on the roof, and provide power, heating, cooling to the body corporate. The body corporate passes that on to the individual units. Great idea? I see a lot of nodding. Well, until we looked at this piece of legislation. This is, every body corporate is governed by a certain set of rules. And these rules are actually driven by a number of regulations, and it depends on the size of the property development. We were a small scheme because it was actually 6 units and not 3 as in my example, but that doesn't really matter. Now, the provider of solar and combined heat and power is actually a service provider to that development. And as a service provider, to a small scheme, because it's a small scheme regulation, your term can be no longer than 1 year. So you would need to achieve cost recovery within 1 year if you have to rely on this piece of legislation. And the body corporate can't actually contract for longer than that. They're not allowed to. And I've actually seen the rules for that Meriton building near the Queensland Police Headquarters. And I actually think they're breaching, in this case, not a small scheme, but the appropriate scheme, I think they're breaching the scheme regulations. But I leave that to others to judge. Because they actually created on-selling arrangements in a specific way in that building. I think it actually breaches the term provisions in the relevant regulations. So our main limitation was that this third party that would have been more than happy to put in the money to put a bit of solar and a combined heat and power installation in there, it was capped out at 1 year of revenue certainty. As you will recall, I mentioned earlier, one of the limiting factors in deploying renewables is revenue certainty and the duration for which you can get that. If you have a 3-year payback, as you probably would have on that system, maybe a 5-year for the solar, or a 7-year for the solar, a 1-year period just doesn't do it. So the entire scheme, despite lots of willing participants, fell over in the end. A very sad example, and again, I've chosen that example to present to you because this is a piece where law reform in Queensland could actually make a significant difference. It's fair enough that small schemes should have not a long tie on service providers, but there are certain types of service providers that need a longer term to actually recover an investment they might need to make. So there could be a section 63A that talks about 10 or 15 years if the service is an energy service. Very, very easy law reform. And I shall leave it at this before I get interrupted. Thank you.